we'll start off with something very simple. What is sleep? Is it actually as uneventful as it seems?
Great question. Until several decades ago, that's kind of how, within health or within medicine and science, how sleep was perceived as this sort of quiet state that exists between two periods of wakefulness, or that quiet state that exists between wakefulness and death. When in fact, now we know so much more about sleep, and we know that it is an extremely active and dynamic state during which the body does a lot of its most necessary physiologic actions. There's so many different things that happen during sleep, and there are so many problems that can affect sleep that not only translate to nocturnal issues at night, but really the concern is daytime issues, right? Because people who suffer from sleep disorders, that suffering that we're talking about, it's really during the daytime. The problem may be occurring at nighttime, but when we're talking about how it affects their quality of life, how it affects their mood, how it affects the way that they perform, the way that they work, the way that they learn, the way that we process emotionally, a lot of these things rest heavily on sleep and sleep quality. So once I discovered that and got to kind of get a whiff of it from a clinical standpoint, that's really what sort of drew my attraction to sleep, in the way that it affects us, and the way that treating people with sleep disorders can really, really be so rewarding in a sense of just giving people back their quality of life.
No, it's interesting because even when I think about it, right, in the moment when you can't sleep, you're like, oh, this night is horrible. But the next day you get so busy in your work that you don't realize that it's not because your day is horrible, it's because your night was horrible. That's why your day is horrible. People become ignorant to that. So it's a very good point.
That's exactly what I mean.
So what should people do? Like, what are good sleep habits, like in general? And then we'll get deeper into things. But in general, what are some good sleep habits people should follow?
Sure. I would say the number one most important sleep habit is sleeping. We live in a sleep-deprived society, and most of us, close to all of us, are self-sleep deprivers. We're constantly curtailing the end of our sleep period by waking up too early. We're constantly pushing ourselves to the furthest extent by going to bed later and later. And then we end up with these, with chronic sleep insufficiency and chronic sleep debt, which can never be paid off. There's no such thing as paying sleep debt. That's such an interesting
thing is sleep debt.
Absolutely.
It's another debt that people have to worry about, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a debt that unfortunately can never be paid back. Now, of course, when we're talking one or a few nights of partial or total sleep deprivation and then a recovery sleep period afterward on the weekend, that's one thing. But when we're talking about chronic sleep loss, you can never pay that sleep debt back. So I think that the most important sleep habit is, number one, to give your body the sleep that it dictates that it requires. And then apart from that, the sleep hygiene always comes up as sort of the topic of, ensuring that you have good sleep habits and a good nighttime or pre-bedtime routine. Things like making sure that your sleep environment is as sleep promoting of an environment as possible, that it's cool. Cool meaning there's a lot of controversy over what is cool. But for example, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, they recommend 65 to 70 degrees. And cool enough to be comfortable, but not too warm, because our body actually wants to get cold during sleep. In fact, the lowest temperature that the human body hits in a 24-hour period is during sleep. About 2 to 3 hours before you naturally awaken is when your body hits its lowest temperature. So your body wants to get cool during sleep, number one. Keeping the room dark and making sure that there are no interferences in terms of our sleep. Your sleep is something that you want to protect. It's something that is fragile. It's labile. It can break. It can be broken. It can be intruded into. So ultimately ensuring that your room is cool, dark, quiet. I always tell people keep a timeless room. Timeless meaning that there are no cues to let you know what time it is.
Because no alarms?
Well, alarms are good to wake you up, but like a clock. Because what happens a lot when we experience, like, for example, a bout of sleep difficulty, we start clock watching. And once we start clock watching, then we start doing math. And then we start thinking to ourselves, okay, I've only been asleep for 30 minutes now, and I have to be awake in 2.5 hours. So how the heck am I going to do this? This has been such a terrible week. Tomorrow is going to be so bad. The fear of the lack of sleep at the detriment that that's going to have on the following day's functioning. And then next thing you know, we get into this perpetual cycle of sleep anxiety and bedtime anxiety, which perpetuates more and more sleep difficulty. And it just becomes this vicious cycle that I'm sure hundreds of millions of people can identify with, that we all experience.